So who has seen the movie The Matrix? Or maybe even the trilogy? All right, well, I have too. So what did you love about the movie? What most people love about the movie is man coming out victorious against the machines, right? But then reality catches us and we see headlines like a study finds nearly half of jobs are vulnerable to automation. That's rather scary. Who do you think of? Yourself in a few years? It seems to be coming fast, right? Are you thinking maybe about your children, your parents? Well, we may all be affected by this. What I want to do in this lecture is talk about what these numbers really mean, where they come from, and what it takes to actually automate over and above the risk of automation. And then once automation has happened, how there are feedback effects that may mitigate what we originally think will happen in terms of job loss. So I really focus on the good news. I'm not dismissing the bad news, and we have things to do, and it is arriving fast. But by focusing on the good news, I also focus attention to the opportunities that may be out there. I help you think about it and make up your own mind about what this all means for you and the ones you care about. All right, so here is the basic outline of the lecture. We're first going to talk about what risk of automation even means, the quote unquote bad news. We're going to see that it's all about technological feasibility. We'll look a little bit at cross-country data to get a better sense of that. And then we'll make an important distinction, namely the one between job versus task automation. And we'll talk about bottleneck skills, which are the skills necessary in the tasks that with the current knowledge we have are very hard to automate. To illustrate that, then we'll look at some US data by selected occupations. Once we get a sense of what these numbers mean and how big they are, we can ask, okay, suppose automation does happen. We introduce this labor-saving machine, software, or artificial intelligence. What happens after that? We'll see through the example of bank tellers in the US who saw a lot of their work being taken over by automatic telling machines, ATMs, that the cost savings may have been so big and the demand elasticity for banking services so high that in the end, we actually saw more bank tellers rather than fewer bank tellers upon automation. All right, so let's get started then. What's the risk of job automation all about? Well, first of all, how much risk of job loss do we face due to artificial intelligence and automation? Well, the numbers come out to be in a very, very wide range, depending on how we measure it. Frey and Osborne started in 2013 and came out with this paper that estimated that 47% of US jobs are at high risk of automation. High risk meaning an above 70% chance of automation. Then Arns and co-authors who wrote a study for the OECD found that number to be only 9% because they looked at individual data before aggregating up, while Frey and Osborne started with very broad occupational categories that were all where the task content was fixed. Arns et al. Used an approach where the task content can vary a lot within an occupation and then aggregate it up. Nedelaska and Quintini in 2018 then did a study using Arntz's study, the same technique, applied to 32 OECD countries, and found that 14% of jobs across the OECD are at very high risk of automation. So let's take a look at the data. So what did they find? They find that the risk of automation varies greatly across countries. The country with the lowest percentage of jobs at high risk of automation is Norway, with 5.7%, and the highest one is the Slovak Republic with 33.6%. The average in the OECD is about 15%. So what makes Norway so much different from the Slovak Republic? Well, it could be that they're completely structured differently and therefore have fewer occupations that are at high risk of automation, or they already have automated in the past and therefore are now facing a residual risk that's much lower. And there's a little bit of both. I'll give you one example in how Norway differs from the Slovak Republic. We all know that developed countries have been moving away from agriculture into industry and then from industry into services. Well, Norway is much further along in that transition from industry to services, whereas the Slovak Republic is lagging behind a lot. So if we take employment, the percent employment in the industry sector, which includes manufacturing and construction and other industries like that, we see that Norway employs only 19% of their workforce in that sector, whereas the Slovak Republic employs 36.8, almost 37% of their workforce in that sector. So in that sector, there's a much higher risk of automation through robots, whereas in the service sector, there are more bottleneck skills that cannot be automated that we'll be talking about, or tasks that cannot be automated that require certain skills. All right, so this is just an example. There's much more going on underneath these numbers. Different occupations are present in Norway compared to the Slovak Republic, and even the same occupations may be organized very differently in the two countries, thereby leading to different risks of automation. Now, if we look a little further, instead of looking at very high risk of automation, we now look at significant risk of automation, which means 50% or more, a chance of 50% or more. Then we see big numbers coming again. And do we really care whether it's a 70% chance or a 50% chance of automation? If that's my job, it's still a high risk. So in Norway, 31% of jobs are at significant or high risk of automation, whereas in the Slovak Republic, 64% of jobs are at significant or high risk of automation. The average in the OECD, so funnily, comes back to the 47% that looks like the number from Frey and Osborne. But of course, that one was for high risk in the US using a very different strategy of measuring this. Now, what is there to keep in mind? These numbers mean that the technology is such that we could automate if we wanted to. Okay, so just because something is technologically feasible doesn't mean we will actually do it. What does it depend on? We'll go into more detail later. But one important feature is whether the technology is actually cheaper than the labor it's supposed to replace. Now, in the Slovak Republic, we may have a lot of jobs at risk of automation because it hasn't been automated yet, because labor is cheaper there than, say, in Norway. All right, so to summarize so far, it is very hard to pinpoint exactly how many jobs are at risk of automation. We saw different numbers that range from 9% to 47%. We can think of those as upper and lower bounds. But it's even harder to determine whether they will actually be automated and when. So what stands in the way of actual job automation? Well, one important distinction to make is job versus task automation. And that for most professions, for most occupations, there are some bottleneck skills that cannot be automated, and therefore some tasks that cannot be automated. So really, when we think of this, we should think about what are the tasks in a particular job that can be automated, and how much of a job loss does that potentially constitute. Now, second, once we know the technological feasibility of task automation, we have to wonder, how much does that technology cost? And how does that compare to the labor cost? It may be that we're not automating for a while because the cost of the technology is not coming down fast enough. If we actually do automate, which means the technology became cheap enough, that means that to produce the same good or service, it now costs us less. That means that the supply shifts out. We're producing more at a lower price, if competition works at all. And therefore, we're going to have a higher output, more production, which then again creates jobs on the other side, even though we have automated away some of the tasks. So that's what I'm really going to be focusing on here. But I do want to mention two other features of the market that may stand in the way of actual job automation. One is consumer preferences for humans. If you've ever talked to a machine on the phone, a customer service machine, quote unquote, you may have wished for an actual person. Also, you can think of robot doctors. I personally am not too keen to be examined by a robot doctor. I still like my human doctor to examine me, even if they are aided by scanners and CT machines and whatnot, computers, software, etc. Ultimately, the one who explains the results to me, the one who actually examines me, I still prefer it to be a human being. Now, not everybody is like me, but there are some people who are like me. And then finally, government policy may intervene. Labor is being taxed. So if we are going to automate, there may be a fairness argument, quote unquote, to also tax the robots or the machines that replace that labor, to keep the distortions the same along both dimensions, labor versus machine. There may also be some risks to humans that governments may want to prevent automation in order to protect humans. And many other things may stand in the way, but I'm going to focus on the first two now. Okay, here we go. So what's a job? A job is a bundle of tasks, right? So here we have task A, task B, task C, and task D. And for simplicity, we'll say, in this job, you spend 25% of your time on each of these tasks. Now, together with this task comes some sort of technology, even if it's just the building you're living in that has an automatic door, that's a technology. So a job is a bundle of tasks combined with a technology. Let's assume this job is a bank teller's job. What do bank tellers do, or what did they do before automatic telling machines were introduced? They would greet clients, they would advise them on what accounts to open and how to use the accounts, and then they would count money and hand out money. So those are the 4 tasks: greeting, advising, handing out money, and counting money. That's where the name comes from. Bank tellers are people who count. Okay, so with this in mind, in each of these tasks now, there will be a set of skills necessary to perform the task. So I'm going to assume here that tasks A and B both use skill 1 and skill 2, whereas tasks C and D require skills 3 and 4. Now, a task can be automated if machines have acquired all the skills necessary to perform the task. So suppose machines have acquired all the skills to automate tasks C and D, which means they have acquired skills 3 and 4. Then maybe we automate, suppose we do. And so what happens, tasks C and D are being swallowed up by the technology. So now the new job is a bundle of tasks with a technology, but there's only tasks A and B left for the worker. How much time are they going to be spending in those tasks? 50% of their time. So what are bottleneck tasks? These are tasks A and B that are difficult to automate given the current state of knowledge. And the skills that are required in these bottleneck tasks, the skills 1 and 2, are the bottleneck skills, the ones that lead to the inability to automate. Note that we only need one of these skills to not be automatable, 1 or 2. So now, unless we change the production process, which means we would redefine tasks so that we can automate some more, unless we do that, there's no further automation possible. Now, for most jobs, there's no such thing as full automation of the job. There's always some kind of bottleneck skill that keeps some labor in the game. However, even though there are bottleneck skills and some labor stays in the game, there is a potential for significant job loss. So a worker in this job now spends 50% of their time in each task A and B, which means that it takes them half as long to do the same job as before, which means they can now do the job of 2 workers. Which means we have a 50% job loss, holding everything else the same. Remember, we economists like to use this Latin phrase, which I never know how to pronounce in English, so I'll stay with holding everything else the same. Okay. So what have we seen so far? As long as there are bottleneck skills, there's no such thing as job automation, but rather task automation. Now, how big is the job loss? It depends on how big the percentage of tasks or the time that we can save is, that can be automated is. Again, holding everything else the same, stay tuned, we're going to get there. So, what are these bottleneck skills? So Frey and Osborne identified 3 types of bottleneck skills. The first one is perception and manipulation. What does it mean? It means the ability to carry out physical tasks in an unstructured work environment. If there was no bottleneck in that kind of skill, distribution centers of Amazon would be fully automated by now. But it is because it is still very hard for machines to look at one of these packages, gauge how much it may weigh, and how to grab it given that they come in all shapes and forms. So the ability to carry out physical tasks in an unstructured work environment is what keeps Amazon from being automated. The second one is cognitive intelligence, everything that has to do with creativity and complex reasoning. So machines are very good at solving problems that we have programmed them to solve, but figuring out what even is a problem is very hard for machines to see, because they don't live in this world and don't see what the concept of a problem might be. We have to feed some sort of problem in there, and the more complex and the more creativity the solution requires, the harder it is for machines to do. Now, that being said, with artificial intelligence, meaning machine learning, machines are getting better and better at figuring out what the problems are further down the line when we tell them what our goal is, what our bottom end goal is. And so maybe there is more and more possibility to automate the cognitive intelligence soon as well. And then finally, there is social intelligence. So that's the ability to effectively negotiate complex social relationships, including caring for others and recognizing cultural sensitivities. So these skills are very hard to automate because we have a hard time pinpointing how we even do this. So it's related to empathy, intuition, things like that. It's called the Polanyi's paradox, that says that we know more than we can say. So if we cannot say how it is that we know that someone needs a hug, we cannot program a machine to do the same. Now, again, there have been machines programmed to imitate psychologists to a degree with quite some success. But every now and then, they just miss something that would be completely obvious to a human psychologist. And so we still cannot automate away all these jobs that require a lot of social intelligence. Now, the OECD study that uses the PIAAC data, which is the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies, has looked a little more closely at these bottleneck skills and identified very narrowly defined categories within those three broad categories, and found that dexterity, all the things you do with your fingers, is the most bottleneck of all skills in perception and manipulation. In the cognitive realm, it's all about problem solving, even simple problem solving that seems intuitive again to us, that is very hard for programs to get behind. Complex problem solving obviously is just a degree further away from automation than simple problem solving might be. And then in social intelligence, a lot of skills remain or are shown to be significant bottlenecks, namely teaching, advising, planning for others, communication, negotiation, and influencing and selling. All right, so having that in mind, how did Nidal, Koska, and Quintini use these bottleneck skills to figure out what the risk of automation is? And here is what they find. So what you do is look at how important the bottleneck skills are in the different occupations and add them up. So here we have problem solving, teaching, planning, influencing, advising. How important are these for different occupations? That's on the horizontal axis. And the higher that bar, the lower the risk of automation, because there's all this bottleneck skill that humans still need to do. If we look on the right, these bars are much lower because the importance of these bottleneck skills on average in those occupations is much lower, and therefore the risk of automation is much higher in those occupations. All right, So let's look at a few occupations in the US and the risk of automation and where it comes from. So here are some occupations with a risk above 50% in the US and what their average risk of automation is. So when we look at food preparation assistants, say anyone who works in a restaurant and chops vegetables, or someone who works in the back at Burger King, at McDonald's, and all these fast food chains, that would be a food preparation assistant. They face a very high risk of automation. There's not many bottleneck skills left for them to do. The front-facing workers, on the other hand, do have to interact with clients, and as long as there are people who prefer to order from a human over ordering from the machine at McDonald's, say, we still have bottleneck skills that are important there. And we're going through laborers, refuse workers, elementary workers, cleaners and helpers, and then drivers, the self-driving car existing already, just not being cheap enough to really replace all these truck drivers. It is coming. So here we have a risk of automation of 54%. There are, again, tasks in those jobs, in those occupations, that are hard to automate. Now, on the other hand, those with the lowest risk of automation are, starting at the bottom, teaching professionals, for example. They have a 21% risk of automation, which means, yes, software and computerization will make their jobs easier and therefore free time, but it's not clear how that time, whether that leads to fewer teachers all that much. People have experimented with online classes and they do not seem to succeed as well as in-person teaching does, which is obviously good news for me, seeing that I'm a teacher. And then we can look at all these others, health professionals, personal care workers. They have fairly relatively low risks of automation because there's this human component in there. Now, science and engineering associate professionals, there the bottleneck skill is more the cognitive one of problem solving and problem spotting, maybe. Now, interestingly, ICT professionals who know how to work with machines very well are also teaching the machines quite a bit. So relatively speaking, their risk is below 40%, but at 39, which is the highest here in this list. And so we see that machine learning is coming and automating away some of those jobs even as well. But now let's get to a bit of the good news. Suppose we have automated away, what happens next? So let's first note that tasks will only be automated if the cost to do so is cheaper than keeping the labor in the loop. So let's take the example of bank tellers versus automatic telling machines, ATMs. ATMs were actually introduced, which means that they must have been cheaper than labor. So if we represent the first effect that we explained earlier with a pie chart into a supply and demand diagram, we see the initial equilibrium at W1 BT1, which is at the intersection of the demand for bank tellers, banks demanding labor, and the supply of bank tellers, people wanting to work as bank tellers. So now, the law of supply says the higher the price, the more I want to supply. The higher the wage, the more people want to be bank tellers. the demand for the demand for bank tellers follows the law of demand, which says that the lower the price, the more I want to demand. So here banks, the lower the wage, which is the price of bank tellers, the more bank tellers I want to hire. Okay, so what happens when ATMs are introduced? The demand curve shifts to the left, wages decrease, and the quantity of bank tellers decreases. So we're moving along the supply of bank tellers after having shifted the demand for bank tellers. So ATMs now do many of the tasks that bank tellers used to do, and therefore we need fewer bank tellers to produce the same amount of banking services. So let's take a look at what that looks like in the data. Here we have the number of human bank tellers since 1970, and it's been steadily increasing with a little blip there in the 2000-2001 recession. And on the other hand, at the same time, ATMs were introduced and the number of bank tellers didn't go down. Now, you may say that if the ATMs had not been introduced, we would have seen a trend, the upward trend in number of human bank tellers to keep going. So maybe it slowed it down a bit, but the number of bank tellers did not decline. Why? Well, what happened in the market for banking services? First, we have the supply of banking services, the demand for banking services, and an initial equilibrium. Again, law of demand, law of supply. And what happens when ATMs are introduced? Think about it. It means that they were cheaper than labor, which means the same amount of banking services can now be produced at a lower cost. That means that for a given price, we're going to offer more banking services. So the supply of banking services shifts out due to the ATMs. What does that mean? The price of banking services has to decrease. So how much you have to give up to get a bank account at a certain bank decreases, or you get more benefits from banking with that bank. That means the price for the same amount of banking services decreases and the amount of banking services goes up. So we're moving along the demand curve to the new equilibrium. The price decreases, banking services increase, and we get to the new equilibrium P2 BS2. Now let's look at the data again. We had the human bank tellers, the introduction of ATMs, and at the same time, on the right side axis, we see the number of bank branches that increased since the 1970s as ATMs were introduced, and therefore we hired more and more human bank tellers. So the number of banking branches increased as ATMs were being introduced, which represents an increase in banking services. So now that in turn again has an effect on the labor market for bank tellers. What is that effect? Well, now that we're producing more banking services than before, all the labor saving goes away again because we need more bank tellers, since there are bottleneck skills, to provide all that extra supply of banking services. So the demand for bank tellers shifts up because we want more banking services, also known as BS. All right, so now how big that shift is will depend. It could be that the wage, we know that the wage W3 will be higher than W2, but we don't know if it will actually be higher than W1, the original wage. Overall, which effect is bigger? The initial effect of introducing ATMs or the ultimate effect of increasing the banking services so much that we need more bank tellers? Well, that depends on, and look at the right graph for a second, it depends on how far the supply of banking services shifts out. What does that depend on? The more cost savings we have thanks to automation, the further that demand, that supply shifts out. That means that we're going to need more bank tellers to satisfy that demand. The other thing that's important is how flat the demand curve is. The flatter the demand curve, the more elastic the demand curve, the more banking services can be absorbed for a small change in the price. So the flatter the demand curve in the right graph, the more elastic, the less satiated, the larger the increase in the quantity of banking services, and therefore the larger the increase in the demand for bank tellers in the end. All right, so finally then, what can we conclude? As long as there are bottleneck skills, the larger the cost savings from automation, the larger the rightward shift of supply of the good or service in question, in this case, banking services. The more elastic the demand for the good or service, the larger the increase in the good or service produced. Yes? So the larger is this movement along the demand curve. And then finally, the larger the increase in the good or services that is produced, the larger the increase in demand for the bottleneck labor. In this case, bank tellers who greet and advise clients mainly. Okay, now there is a third piece to this bank telling story, which is that from 2008, as you can see here, the number of bank branches, the blue line, decreased, and the number of bank tellers also decreased. So what happened here? What happened here? Well, what happened is that we went more and more from banking in branches to online banking and customer support. So that's basically what I mentioned earlier, a way of redefining the tasks, reinventing the production process for banking services, which changes the tasks. In this case, it changes the tasks so much that we cannot call these people bank tellers anymore. So they are moving from one occupational category to another because they're not really telling anymore. Telling meaning counting. And so it looks like, oh God, we have a job loss, there's fewer bank tellers, but really these people are doing the exact same thing as they did in the branch, but now they're doing it on the phone and are called customer support people, not bank tellers. All right, so we always have to be careful with what we see in the data, because what seems like a decrease here is really just a redefinition of a task that leads to a redefining of occupation, and therefore we're losing out on these people when we look at the bank teller numbers, when really these jobs have not been lost, they just appeared in a different category. All right, so to conclude then, what we have learned is that measuring automation and risk, and especially the timing of when it is going to happen, is really difficult. We have seen that the risk of job automation, what we see as the bad news, is really just a statement about technological feasibility. We looked at cross-country data relating to that. And then we looked at an important distinction, which is job versus task automation, and what bottleneck skills are still keeping humans in the loop. We looked at some occupations for the US. And then we saw that even if we have automation, there are market feedback effects. That's the good news. So goods and services become cheaper through the labor saving upon automation, but then given that it's cheaper to produce, they also become cheaper to consumers. For the most part, we get a shift out in the supply of these goods and services. The bigger the cost savings are, the bigger that is, and therefore actually get a positive effect on the demand for the remaining bottleneck skills. So on the demand for labor in that original occupation that was affected by automation. What is important though is the demand elasticity. It turned out that banking services, people were very happy to have bank branches closer by, have a bank branch 2 miles away instead of 5. So this kind of increase in banking services was very welcomed by consumers. But is that the same for all markets? So for example, if fast food production becomes yet cheaper and we save on labor at the front end for taking the orders, are we really going to produce more fast food? And does demand want more fast food? How sensitive to the price are we? Are we going to buy more fast food because the price decreases a little bit? It's not very clear, and it's also not clear we should. But what could happen is that fast food, our demand for quality of fast food goes up, which then brings new jobs in again to invent and present the fast food better. I can tell you one thing, when I was a kid, McDonald's was much less clean than it is now. We expect even a fast food restaurant to be clean now, and for that, we need people to clean it. So far, we haven't found a machine that can really do it well. And we also expect good service from fairly cheap restaurants. And it may be that the fast food industry will increase the amount of service it puts on top of its products, thereby creating a higher demand for social skills, communication skills, interactive skills of the staff in those fast food industries. So there's many things to think about, but really overall, I want you to keep a perspective on the numbers that you read, the headlines that you've seen, and see that there may be opportunity in all of these developments where we're not just seeing job loss, but also an increase in quality for a decrease in the price of goods and services, which then, if done right, if the right people come up with the right ideas for the new opportunities to create jobs for people, we can actually still live very well and just be more human, be more of a puzzle solver, be more of an empathetic caretaker. And if all goes well, we'll even be paid well for it. Okay, this is it for today. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.